Today we have the pleasure of interviewing Professor Gilbert Harman. Gilbert Harman is the James S. McDonald Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Princeton University. His expertise spans a wide range of topics, including cognitive science, philosophy of mind, ethics, epistemology, linguistics, and statistical learning theory. Professor Harman holds numerous academic honours, the most recent of which is being named a Fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. His most recent book, co-authored with Princeton electrical engineering professor Sanjeev Kulkarni, is An Elementary Introduction to Statistical Learning Theory, which explains how statistical learning theory might serve as a foundation for inductive reasoning. Professor Harman, could you explain what statistical learning theory is and how we might use it as a basis for inductive reasoning?
Well, statistical learning theory is mathematics. So it's what it is a study of a situation in which you're getting some examples of something and you're trying to generalize about it or make predictions about it. Maybe you're not generalizing. It could be you're trying to figure out how to assess people coming through the airport screening, or whatever. It could be, or you're trying to choose, you're trying to do quality control on a product, a car. So you get certain measurements, and then you have to decide: is this car finished or not? Is it going to work, or should we send it back for other stuff? And there's a certain amount of probability or statistics involved because you're going to base your judgment on the observable features of the object as it comes along. And there's not a perfect correlation between the observable features and the thing you're interested in. So for example, maybe you're hiring people for a job, right? And your evidence might be how they perform in an interview. Well, this is only imperfectly correlated, if at all, with how well they're going to do for the job. Or you're trying to decide whether, well, as I say, you're trying to decide whether this product is defective or not. Again, you're going to go by some observable features, but they typically won't determine whether or not the thing is defective. And so what you'll get initially are a lot of examples that are labeled by experts, or somehow they know, this is an example of a defective car, and this is not. So you're giving various things, and so you end up with your data being observable features and some verdict about it. And now what you want to do is, in the future, you're going to look at new things, and you're going to try to get verdicts about them. Maybe you're setting up a quality control system, or maybe you're trying to evaluate candidates for a job, or whatever it might be. So that's what you're doing on the basis of your evidence here. And so you have to make some assumptions. This isn't a problem of inductive reasoning, right? You have the data don't determine new cases, because the world could blow up, or could be completely different in the future. So you have to make some assumptions. So the first issue here is, what assumptions do you have to make? And if you make those assumptions, what can you show? Well, what the statistical learning theory tries to consider is you make some minimal assumptions about the data, about the initial conditions and the data, and then you see what you can show about that. And then you make how you have various possible ways you might generalize on the data, and you want to know how good are these methods. And there are a variety of methods, and some are better in some respects and some are better in other respects, and you prove theorems about this.
Okay. So how similar is a statistical learning theory to the process of human reasoning?
Well, certainly humans are not very good at probabilistic reasoning or ordinary statistical reasoning. They get distracted by the wrong things, and they make famous probabilistic mistakes. They think they'll make judgments that are actually logically inconsistent. It may be that some aspects of statistical learning theory might help you in thinking how more your unconscious activities do rather than your conscious reasoning. But it's not clear that that's true.
So do you think statistical learning theory perhaps highlights how unreasonable humans are, or can be used to demonstrate it?
Well, how unreasonable people are with probability things is something that's been studied by psychologists, and in particular Daniel Kahneman, who until recently was a professor at Princeton in psychology. He's just written a book. Well, he's written other books too. He just came out with a popular book about this. Statistical learning theory by itself is just this mathematical theory.
Okay.
And the question is, how do you apply that to other things?
Okay. I understand that you have doubts about a priori knowledge, or don't believe in it at all. How does that affect your understanding of epistemology in general?
Okay, well, epistemology is the theory of knowledge, the theory of what people are justified in believing and things of that sort. Philosophers use the term a priori in a pretty strong sense. That is, to have a priori knowledge of something is to, first of all, be justified in accepting it and perhaps knowing it without needing any so-called empirical evidence. So an example of something you might know a priori would be theorems of mathematics, things of this sort. And my doubts about a priori are about the usefulness of this concept in philosophy, this idea of things that are absolutely a priori, so that you can know them and you don't need to worry about empirical evidence, is that you never know whether you're going to need whether empirical evidence is going to be relevant or not. So for a long time, people thought that that Euclidean geometry and certain axioms of Euclidean geometry were knowable a priori, and you didn't need to worry about evidence. Well, and also they thought is that geometry has something to do with actual space. And now physicists have argued that actual space is not actually describable by Euclidean geometry, that it has a certain kind of what they call curvature, so that the angles in a Euclidean geometry, the angles in a triangle have to add up to exactly 180 degrees. But that's apparently not true in the real world. So there are other cases like this where something that people have thought is a priori turned out to be wrong. So those things, anyway, you couldn't know without getting evidence because you couldn't know them. They were false.
But you don't think it's actually impossible for there to be such a thing as a priori knowledge? It's just not useful as a concept? Or? Well,
I am against philosophers relying on the concept of... Well, then there's this question, what you mean by a priori? You sort of, this vague sense I just gave it. Plato thought that there are these things we know, and how do we know them? He gave some example about teaching somebody some geometry. And now how did that person do this? Something about the angle of a square, the diagonal of a square is not a rational multiple of any of the two sides. Well, and he gets this guy to figure it out. How could he do that? And Plato's theory was that, well, before you were born, you existed in a world of forms, and in there you could see these things, and that's how you knew about all the forms. Well, that's a theory, you know, and unfortunately the example doesn't work. Later, philosophers thought maybe, so for Plato it was innate. You had innate knowledge of this because before you were born you got this knowledge. And then more recently people have thought, well, maybe evolution has built this stuff into you, so it's innate that way. But you know, again, there's this thing that the stuff that you saw back when you were wandering on the forums might not be true, and similarly the stuff that evolution put into you may not be accurate. So it's not... So then the thought was, maybe these things are somehow true by virtue of meaning. That was more of a 20th century idea. And I think that doesn't work either. So I've become quite...
Could you explain that a little bit more about how the true by meaning doesn't work?
Well, a lot of things that, just as a lot of geometry turned out to be more complicated than people thought, the geometry of the physical world, so too, a lot of things people have thought were analytic, true by virtue of meaning. See, that there's a kind of explanatory claim there. This is what explains why this true has something to do with meaning, and nothing else. Mm-hmm. And it's unclear what that comes to. That is, does meaning have this explanatory power? And there are lots of things that people have given as examples of things that are true by definition. You might say, bachelor is an unmarried man. Mm-hmm. Well, then if you actually study how people use the word bachelor, turns out it doesn't quite fit that, right? So unmarried man, well, then there are variations. Do you mean has never been married or is not married at the moment? And what do you do about, there was somebody who was in the society pages when I was first thinking about this many years ago, when they had society pages, I guess. And he was described as a bachelor, although he was actually still married, but he was in the process of getting divorced. Mm-hmm. But he was acting like he was dating people and things like that, And now, and people are quite willing nowadays to talk about women bachelors. There's some question about homosexual couples, male homosexual couples, are they bachelors or not? And that's something that seems to have changed over time from when I was starting out in life, and now people say, no, they wouldn't call them bachelors, but back in the, say, the 60s or 50s, people did call them bachelors.
So you're talking a lot about the analytic. Could you possibly describe the difference between the analytic and the synthetic, and talk about how your beliefs about a priori knowledge affect your understanding of the two concepts?
Well, in a way, so the analytic truths are truths that are allegedly true by virtue of meaning, mm-hmm. And then the question is, does that mean true by definition, or how exactly do we understand that? Synthetic truths are truths that are not true by virtue of meaning, but by virtue of meaning, not true only by virtue of meaning, true by virtue of meaning plus something else. So the reason I brought up that with respect to the a priori is that in the 20th century there was a movement for a while, which has gone away, of trying to identify what's a priori with what's analytic, because the idea was that these things you could know them a priori because they were true by virtue of meaning. Didn't mean you knew them your whole life, because maybe when you were born or when you were young, maybe you didn't have the concepts. But once you had the concepts, then you could know that these things are true just by virtue of your understanding of the concept.
Do you think then that all claims are synthetic rather than analytic?
I think that's a good working hypothesis, because a lot of things that have been claimed to be analytic turned out not to be. And there's a more theoretical reason here, because people use the term analytic in a number of different ways. But if you include their analytic by virtue of meaning, there's a kind of explanatory thing there, that by virtue of meaning. And then there's this question, well, how could they have this explanatory power? It's like, one example I used to use was witches. Witches were described as people with supernatural powers, and so the supernatural powers were used to explain things that witches could do. Well, then it turned out there weren't any, and the question is whether in talking about analyticity, it's like talking about witches. You're talking about, there's this implicit or maybe explicit claim about explanatory power, but it's not clear how that works out. Part of the thing here is that something that gets defined a certain way at one time that is, when somebody gives a definition, it's a lot like saying, let's assume for the moment that bachelors are unmarried males, okay, and then we'll use it, and then it follows that but your usage for that period doesn't carry over till the next day. So scientists often will define, force equals mass times acceleration, or at one point, acids are proton donors, but the definition of acid changes over time. The definition of force and so on may change over time. So, because for one thing, the notion of mass gets divided into different notions.
What if it were empirically true that a definition had never changed and we had never had any evidence for it changing? Would that be sufficient grounds to believe that it might be stable, and therefore true by meaning? Or?
Well, there's this problem about what that means, true by meaning, true by virtue of meaning. You see, because you raised the question, how can its meaning make it true? So then people have, I don't know if I'll start anticipating some other stuff there, but so one thing that had happened, Quine was one person that sort of popularized this view, although not everybody accepted it, was that really the way people reason about things and the way concepts work is more like there's a web of things you believe, and they modify each other in certain ways. I think you're going to have a question about reasoning in there, which is relevant to that. You want me to go into that?
We could talk about that now. Yes, definitely.
So it's connected with logic and reasoning. So sometimes people think logic is a theory of reasoning. Now, I think that's just clearly a mistake, and there's an ambiguity in the word logic, and there's an ambiguity in the word reasoning. And they give you this idea. So when you take logic courses, you're learning how to reason. Well, no, you're not. In fact, that's the experience of anybody who teaches logic. It's very hard for people to really grasp the stuff, and they get all mixed up. And then there are these rules on logic, like the rule that a proposition P, from that follows a disjunction, P or Q. And students, anyway, have a lot of trouble with that. Not the practice. John Burgess wouldn't have any trouble with that. But because the students are thinking, well, why would I, if I believe P, why would I then go on to infer P or Q? It doesn't make sense, right? And really, but if you explain it to, look, if P is true, then P or Q has to be true, right? It's a question of implication, not of inference. Then there's no problem. They don't have any problem with that. Unfortunately, the logic texts talk about rules of, you have some premises and you have rules of inference and a conclusion, and the inference part gets people confused because it isn't really inference, it's implication.
Could you expand a little on the difference between implication and inference then?
So implication is a relation between propositions. So if one proposition or a collection of propositions implies another, that says if these things are true, that has to be true. Mm-hmm. Inference is, and so another way to put that is logic is a theory basically of implication. It's formal, not every implication, but formal implication by virtue of the form of the statements. And it also includes a theory of inconsistency, things that contradict each other. Those are the two main things about logic. There's nothing in there about psychology. There's nothing about any psychological process like reasoning. It's not normative in any way. It doesn't say if so-and-so, then you ought to do so-and-so. Mm-hmm. It's a study about, it's like math. It's a kind of math, a very simple math, right? Math involving the mathematics of implication. That's all it is. Reasoning is a matter of what you believe and how you change your beliefs and how you modify your beliefs in the light of new thinking. Typically, so what happens is you have a lot of beliefs, and then you get some new information, you start thinking about something, and then you modify your set of beliefs. And And one model of that, which I think is plausible, is it's a kind of constraint satisfaction network. There are certain constraints on the changes you can make in your beliefs. First of all, the most important constraint is conservatism. You mostly try not to make changes, right? I mean, if you couldn't, for example, just give up everything you believe, then where could you go from there? You try to make limited, but you will make changes in order to increase the coherence in one or another way of your beliefs, where that might be try to get rid of inconsistency, something you'll never fully do. Try to add some explanation or connections between things of that sort. Try to address questions that you're interested in answering, and then partly get into practical reasoning where you're trying to decide what to do. Should you change your plans or not, things like that. But all these things there's certain constraints: conservatism and positive coherence, and negative coherence, avoid inconsistency, positive coherence, try to get things more connected. And so there are ways to model that kind of thing in a computer with these so-called constraint satisfaction networks. A friend of mine does that sort of thing.
Okay, so while we're on the subject of talking about psychology and cognitive science, I understand that you both use philosophy of mind. You apply it to understandings about the findings of neuroscience, of cognitive science, and you also apply cognitive science to questions in the philosophy of mind. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the interaction between your philosophy of mind theories and your studies of cognitive science.
Well, let me begin by saying philosophy is part of cognitive science, or parts of philosophy are parts of, and more generally, subjects, as taught at the university, tend to overlap. Mm-hmm. So, and philosophy maybe overlaps more than other subjects, because we overlap literature departments, we overlap psychology, we overlap linguistics. We don't have a department, we should, but we don't. Mm-hmm. It overlaps computer science, and things of that sort, and economics, political theory. So you will get people who are doing what philosophers would consider philosophy, but they're in other departments, like the ones I mentioned. And people in philosophy could be interacting with people in these other departments. You get a lot of that. And so in our department, there's a tremendous amount of interaction with others. And my case may be among the more extreme, but I've taught courses in operations research, electrical engineering, computer science, psychology, and linguistics, and probably some philosophy. But often I teach, much of my teaching is with people in other departments or other parts of the university. And that's not uncommon in philosophy. Okay. I take Anthony Appia or...
Do you find there are particular implications for coming from a philosophical background in studying cognitive science, or the other way around, so that having a particular take on things affects the way that you interact with another department?
I'm not certain I understand what you're asking, but the way I interact with people in the other, I started out with wide interests. I started out in machine translation. It was like my first publications. And I came to Princeton, I taught courses. The first year I taught transformational grammar, artificial intelligence, and Kant's second critique. So I have these kind of, but again, I don't know that I'm particularly unusual in that respect.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll ask instead about,
go ahead.
In your classic 1990, The Intrinsic Quality of Experience, you you defend functionalism by addressing some of its criticisms. I was wondering if you could explain what functionalism is and discuss how you see it as an alternative to dualism in explaining cognitive and mental events?
Well, so dualism is the idea there are two basic kinds of substances: physical substances and mental substances. And this is something perhaps Descartes introduced into the philosophical world. I don't know. I'd have to ask Dan Garber if that's right. And it gives rise to all kinds of problems about what's the interaction between the mental and the physical. And there are various kinds of answers. So, like, idealism is the idea there's just the mental, and the physical is just images created in your mind, but they don't really exist. And physicalism is the opposite. They're just the physical, and the mental stuff is somehow to be explained in terms of the physical. So functionalism is a version, or can be a version, of that second view. And it's the idea that if you take a complicated thing like an animal or a person, and you sort of figure out how it works by, now we haven't got this far yet, it's a pie in the sky theory, but we really do analyze what's going on in its brain and things like that, and we could sort of get a so-called functionalist account of that stuff. Then that would be an account of the mental, or could be, part of that would be an account of the mental aspects of the thing. That is, so the animal sees things and hears things and reacts in certain ways. Well, you'll have a completely physical explanation of what's going on. Then your stuff, what's in the mind, would be something like not really, but something like what goes on in a computer. Just as you have this computer, right, and it's got these all-purpose thing, and it's kind of homogeneous on the inside, whereas we're not in our brains. But just if you want to explain how the computer's working, you got to do it in somewhat kind of abstract fashion. There are too many little. You can't just say what's happening in every one of the cells in it and so on. But rather, you give some more. You have to give some thing. This part, here that you're doing addition, or here you're reacting to what's coming over the visual system and so on.
So you could create a functional model of an animal, say, without full knowledge of what's going on in its brain, or would you need full knowledge of what's going on in its brain?
Well, of course, models don't have to be precisely the same as the real thing, but if you want to really if you really want to understand the thing, you have to probably study how it works. And of course, this is something that's on in neuroscience now, and usually a lot of it is done with animals, some of it, but now with these so-called functional magnetic resonance imagery, you can sort of get some sense, especially as these machines get better and better, to get more finer and finer image of what's happening. And they begin to get some sense and maybe make hypotheses about how things are functioning in there, right? And it turns out probably that it's pretty distributed. It's not. So some things maybe you can locate. You could say, well, emotion is right about here, and other stuff, but then it's not even clear about that.
Can you describe John Searle's Chinese room argument and how a functionalist might respond to it for us?
So Searle developed this argument quite a while ago. Was it 30 years ago? I don't know, a long time ago. And the idea, there was at the time work in a certain kind of artificial intelligence, which actually probably doesn't exist anymore, because they ran into a big problem in the 80s, so-called problem of computational complexity. But anyway, the idea was, in particular, was a guy named Roger Schenck who was working on this, but a lot of people had this idea, that you would develop computer models of how people understand what other people are saying and how you might react to it. But in particular, he was honing in on that thing, this idea that you would build a device which could. So one of the things Schenck was doing, he would have his machine read newspaper stories and then produce a summary of it. And he had the machine. There was this idea there's certain scripts you might use to understand things, you know. And so you would try to find that when those scripts were happening. Well, in any event, Searle said, well, look, that's not going to work, because that is, you can't then suppose that's what the mind is, or that's what understanding is. So because Shank was saying this, I'm going to build a machine that understands these news stories. There's another guy more recently been doing that in Texas. And the thought is that, well, so Searle said, look, suppose you build one of these things, you get this program of understanding, and suppose what you're doing is this program is going to understand Chinese, and it's going to be able to have conversations in Chinese, and in this way it will be understanding Chinese. So Searle says, well, look, suppose you get that program written, and now you build a big room and you get some guy who's going to function as the central processor in that machine, because Searle, they were imagining at that time kind of standard computer with one CPU in it doing the work. And that guy, so then what will happen is some message he imagines being put under the door of the room, and the guy comes over and reads the message and looks at the message. It doesn't mean anything to him, you know, but he's got some instructions, you know, and he follows these instructions and he works things out, and then he writes something down on a thing and sends it out through the door. And so he's getting messages in Chinese and he's sending out messages in Chinese, but he doesn't understand Chinese. So the argument was simply following these rules wouldn't give you understanding of Chinese, right? And people said, well, but look, he's like the central, we're not supposing the central processor understands that. So then Searle said, well, imagine that we do away with the room, and what happens is the guy internalizes those instructions. So, and furthermore, he can do it real fast, you know. So now somebody comes and talks to him in Chinese, and he's quickly analyzing it and then shooting out some sounds which are an appropriate response. And again, he doesn't understand what's happening, but he's acting like he's giving all the impression of being a Chinese speaker. So that's Searle's argument. So that's the argument, that just having the functioning like a Chinese speaker is not yet to understand Chinese.
And do you agree that that's not yet to understand Chinese? Where do you stand on the issue?
Well, it's hard to answer that, because, as I say, Searle gave this argument quite a long time ago, and he published it in the journal where there were lots of replies, and since then, and there have been lots of replies, and then after many years, he published a new version of it in the same magazine with lots of replies again, and the people replying were sort of divided on this. You know, some thinking, well, that works, and some thinking, oh, that's crazy, you know, and so on. Like one of them suggested, maybe now, once that guy's done that, he has got inside him a little Chinese person. Maybe it's like split personality, right? He has a Chinese person inside and a real person. And that Chinese person is experiencing Chinese, but he's not. Well, so I think it would be rash for me to know what I think about this, but I mean, I'm inclined to think that Searle is, I mean, I don't fully understand Searle's method. I don't think Searle thinks that, I don't think Searle is a dualist exactly in the sense that Descartes was, but
how would you interpret Searle? How would one interpret Searle as a dualist?
Well, as a dualist, you might say, look, the thing that's missing here is the mental stuff. You've got all the functional stuff, but you don't have the mental stuff. In order to understand things, you got to have the mental stuff.
Okay.
But you know, there are all sorts of ways in which even the internalized guy who can do Chinese, if you ask him, well, what did you just say in Chinese? You said that in English to him. He wouldn't know, wouldn't be able to respond. So he's not fully imagining. But what if he could respond? That is, what if you build it in such a way that he can respond? Then you begin to think, well, maybe that's what, if you get enough stuff like that, then but it's not obvious. It's like it gets complicated after a while.
Okay. I was wondering if you could explain the Turing test and your understanding of it as a test of behaviorism. Do you think it is a valid test of behaviorism? And also how it might be relevant to the debate between dualism and behaviorism.
Yeah, well, this is connected with the Chinese room. So the Turing test is a test, the way Turing set it up, the question was, could you do an intelligent machine, a machine that showed intelligence? And Turing suggested this. He said, well, at the moment when I'm writing this thing, he said, we can't use intelligent of a machine, but if we get machines that go far enough, then we'll start calling them intelligent. And so he imagined that there were 3 rooms. There's one room where there's a subject. You bring some ordinary person in, and you have 2 other rooms, one of which there's a person, and one of which there's a computer. And you communicate to the person in the room here, the subject, and the subject can ask questions of both things, and then they respond. Both the machine and the other person responds, and then it keeps going until the subject thinks he knows which is which, and then he says, "I think that's the computer, and that's the thing," and so on. So that's the test. Mm-hmm. And what Turing thought is that if the subject if it gets to a point where subjects are only right 50% of the time, then they're not able to distinguish. Then people can't consistently distinguish between the machine and the person. And, excuse me. And that means that you might as well say that the machine has some kind of intelligence, because it can respond intelligently. It has intelligence in that sense. Of course, we're getting near that in certain limited areas, right? You talk to your iPhone. Do you have an iPhone?
Talk to BlackBerry.
Huh? No.
No, not
you talk to. So there's this thing in the iPhone you can talk to. It's called Siri, and it'll talk back to you, and you can give it orders, and it will do things. And in some ways, can be very surprising, and in other ways, it doesn't work at all. But
how would one? Do you think one could still argue for a dualistic view of things, even in the situation where computers are indistinguishable from humans? An individual cannot distinguish between a computer and a human. Could you still defend dualism? Not saying you'd want to, but
could one defend dualism? Well, maybe. I mean, really, the one way to set this up would be to imagine not just computers, but a robot. Suppose you got a robot that looked like a person, but inside was just a computer, maybe a lot of computers, small computers, the way they are in people, these little neurons, maybe each of them is a computer, right? And
I guess what I'm asking is, do you think dualism depends on some kind of ability to distinguish externally between a computer and a human, or could it be something else altogether?
I think dualism is compatible with thinking you couldn't distinguish. I mean, a dualist might wonder whether he or she is the only one with these experiences. Maybe the others are just machines. Yeah. That's like you get into the other minds problem. How do I know there are the other minds? I know I've got a mind, or I've got this thing I call a mind. How do I know other people do? So you would have that, and then there are people who. I knew somebody who was a solipsist. When I was a graduate student in philosophy, he was another one. And for example, if he didn't like you, he would close his eyes and you were gone. You weren't there. It was like you knew that then you would just do that.
Wow.
But so there are people, and that.
Yeah. Interesting.
And that it used to be a problem. I don't know if people still worry about that. Am I the only person with with experiences like this? I know I am, but how do I know anybody else is? That's the mind-body problem, or the other mind's problem.
In your famous first chapter of The Nature of Morality, you describe an argument that moral facts are irrelevant to the explanation of moral judgments. Can you explain why this argument seems to undermine ethical realism and how one might respond to this argument?
Yes, the ethical realism is the view that there really are these moral facts. And one question would be, how do we get evidence for the existence of one or another moral fact? And so in that chapter I describe a case where you see somebody doing something very bad and you have a very negative reaction. And you might say, I see that it's wrong. But the question is, how can that be? How can you actually see the wrongness of the thing that this person is doing? You see this person doing something, but part of your reaction to the person is emotional. You have an emotional reaction, and that's partly determined by your, you might say, your moral psychology. So, if in cases of science, you can come to learn about things like atoms and molecules because assumptions about them help to explain your observations. But that is like, I mean, even back in the ancient philosophers thought that the wind was evidence that there are these tiny particles being blown around, because that explains why you get moved around by the wind. And that's an explanatory hypothesis. So, but what kind of explanatory hypothesis is involved in thinking that this person's cruelty to an animal, for example, is wrong?
Can I possibly propose a possible
Yes,
one?
good, please.
That many people from all sorts of different people would have a similar response to it in thinking that it is bad. Could that not be evidence for its badness?
Well, that would be evidence, at least, for some similarities in the moral sensibility of a lot of different people. And then the question is, what led to that? And it may be that that's societally and socially incorporated. It might be that it's innate, and there's some kind of explanation in terms of evolution. For example, somebody's fear of snakes is innate, not based on experience with snakes. You see a snake for the first time, you might be afraid, or the prohibition against incest might be determined by evolution having built into people a repugnance for incest. And these things could be quite unconnected. Now, in the case of the snake, you might say, well, good, you want to avoid snakes. You can see why evolution would do that. But, in the case of incest, it may be at one time this was something to worry about, but it's much less something to worry about in an age of contraception, things like that.
But I still want you to go back to the issue
Yeah.
of if you're witnessing something, there is a causal factor in front of you,
Yeah.
and you're having a response to
Yes.
it. I can understand your difficulty with attributing any response solely to the causal factor. So my response of feeling something is bad solely to it being bad because I'm participating in my interaction with whatever.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But how can you attribute it only to the person rather than to the cause? So how can you say that I think something is bad only because I have that response built into me, rather than because the thing is also participating in the reaction?
Well, certainly suppose you see somebody torturing a dog,
Mm-hmm.
And you have this negative reaction. So, and now you think it's wrong, and now the question is, does the wrongness of this guy's doing that help to explain your reaction? And the question is, how does it do that? That is, in the case of the wind, you can sort of understand what the connection is between these tiny particles. and people being blown or sails being blown around. But what is it about wrongness that, how does the wrongness matter? What if it wasn't wrong? Right? Wouldn't you still have the same reaction? How does that?
Perhaps not. If it wasn't wrong, I wouldn't feel the same sense of it being wrong. I wouldn't react in the same way to it.
Why not? I mean, you come around, you see this guy torturing the dog. But if you still have your same sensibility, it's not like the wrongness is like a color, so that if it was a different color, you wouldn't, if it's red rather than blue, you wouldn't see the other color, you'd see whatever color you see. But now wrongness isn't something you can see. So where does it come from? How is it affecting your reaction? How is the actual wrongness of that affecting your...
I guess that's to assume, though, that wrongness could be something removable. And if it was not removable, if it wasn't a colour but an actual property of the event, the torturing of the dog, if it was not removable, you cannot imagine a case of a torturing dog where it isn't wrong.
Okay, but still, no, I agree with that, but
so then,
there are going to be other people that don't see, Michael Vick comes out and looks at this and, oh, great, let me help. He's not seeing it as wrong. And maybe there are other people. Maybe if you had Hopi Indians back when they were being investigated by Richard Brandt back in the 50s, he found that they were not bothered at all by what we would consider cruelty to animals.
okay.
Or for that matter, certain kinds of factory farmers, probably not bothered.
So the only way wrongness could actually be a quality rather than a colour, or is by it being intrinsic, and we don't experience it to be intrinsic because people experience the wrongness in different situations.
Well, it's not, I don't know about intrinsic, but even if it's intrinsic, I mean, the real question is, how does that wrongness, how does its being wrong explain your reaction? Now remember, so this is, as I said, this is chapter 1, right? I'm raising this problem, this explanatory problem, and then the rest of the book talks about ways you could respond to that problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you can respond to it, but not,
Okay.
but it's still a problem, I think. I don't think it has an obvious solution.
Okay. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about was whether you think there is any sense in which something could have some sort of objective value by the nature of the fact that people always experience it with they always have a consistent value experience of it. So you could say that something merited a particular value experience because everyone experienced it that way, or one person always experienced it that way.
Well, of course, it's going to be hard to find something that everybody, because you get people who are amoral. And
Let's
don't
specify
have...
to one person. Or
Yeah. Well, there's still this question of how. So people do have this. Say everybody has this experience, or this one person always has that experience. How does that explain, though? How does the wrongness correlate with his always having that experience? Now, maybe, so one kind of solution is to say, well, it's like colors. And this is one classic solution in the history of philosophy. So, objects strictly speaking, objects are not, they're not intrinsically colored. The colors things seem to have the colors they seem to have to us has a lot to do with our perceptual system, and probably they don't look the same to other animals. Maybe some other animals. There are animals that can see kinds of frequencies that we can't see, and we can see frequencies that a lot of animals can't. And there are also colorblind people. who don't see everything we see, or maybe they see more things than we see.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's a model for ethics. So that really so you might say what makes something red is that it has certain properties that affect the color perception of people so that it looks red to them. So that's what it is to be red. In some cases, and now it's the thing, so now you can get a kind of explanatory connection between some property of the object by virtue of which it's red and the perception of the other person. This is a theory. It doesn't work, but it's a theory. Okay.
Why does it not work?
Well, the trouble is there are other theories. There are different theories, and the question is which best. So maybe some things maybe work like that. But some, well, it's tricky. I mean, so the incest thing is like one case where everybody has this disposition to feel disgust, or most people, I mean, not everybody, have the disposition, but the disgust, blind people, maybe they don't, but, but nevertheless, it doesn't, on reflection, it doesn't seem to be correct to say incest is always wrong. You can understand how we have that view, and it's a very hard view to break. But that is, it looks, under certain conditions, incest is not going to have bad consequences. But it's very hard to, I must say, to convince people that it's not wrong. So there's a famous, this guy, Jonathan Haidt, has done these experiments called dumbfounding experiments. He gets naive subjects, comes in, he says, what do you think about this? He tells some story of these brother and sister, they always liked each other, they go off and they have incest, they use 2 kinds of contraception, and he says, well, what do you think about that? They said, that was disgusting, that's wrong. Well, why? And he says, well, because look, they could have malformed children. They make things up, because people, it's not like your thought that incest is wrong is based on reasons. You have an immediate reaction. Then you start thinking of reasons to justify this reaction. You say, oh, they said, well, how could they have children? They have 2 kinds of contraception. Well, they talk about various things. Ask anybody. Anybody will tell you it's wrong. So do you think that if everybody thinks something's wrong, that makes it wrong? What about back in the slave owning? Well, okay. And finally, after you go through a lot of things, then they say, well, I don't know why it's wrong, but it's wrong. Anyway.
But that doesn't make it wrong.
No.
It's been really great having you. Thank you. It's been fascinating.